Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you, as well as our good friends from C-SPAN, to the McGowan Theater located in the National Archives building here in Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Swanson, Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum, as well as the producer for the Noontime Lecture Series. Before we begin today's program, I'd just like to remind you of a few other programs we've got coming up in the near future. On Thursday, March 16th at 7 p.m., Damian Shields will present a lecture on the Forgotten Irish Immigrant Experiences in America. This will be the U.S. Book launch of the book, and there will be a book signing following. Then on Wednesday, March 22nd at 7 p.m., we'll present a film screening and discussion of Following Seas, which is presented in partnership with the DC Environmental Film Festival. To find out more about these and our other programs, please take one of our monthly calendar of events, which you'll find in the racks in the theater lobby, or you can visit our website at www.archives.gov/calendar. Our topic for today is Agent 110, An American Spy Master and the German Resistance in World War II by Scott Miller. Scott Miller is an author and former foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. His first book, The President and the Assassin, McKinley, Terror and the Empire at the Dawn of the American Century, was a Newsweek magazine must-read summer selection. As a journalist, Miller spent nearly 2 decades in Asia and Europe, reporting from more than 25 countries, including 2 postings in Germany, which is his backdrop for Agent 110. He has appeared on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, National Geographic Channel, CNBC, and Britain's Sky News. He also holds degrees in economics and communications and earned a Master of Philosophy in International Relations from the University of Cambridge. Please join me in welcoming Scott Miller to the National Archives.
Thanks, Doug. I thought what I would do today is talk a little bit about kind of the background behind this book, how I came to write it, introduce you to some of the characters along the way, and then describe a little bit about sort of the final product, and then we'll have time for questions and any comments that you have afterwards. I will readily confess that I did not set out to write this book. I was originally very interested in the early days of Americans' involvement in the Vietnam War. That whole period was always held an interest for me. Really right after the war, the French involvement in Indochina. And it also seemed like a subject that hadn't been done to death already. So I began to do a little bit of research, and I happened across these 2 characters. There they are. Those are the Dulles brothers. Allen Dulles is in the lighter colored jacket. He was director of the CIA during the 50s and during the period I was interested in. And the gentleman in the dark suit is his older brother, John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State. When I found these 2 guys, I thought, boy, there's got to be an interesting story here. It's an interesting time in American history. There's 2 brothers, and I thought there's got to be a sort of a good relationship. There's got to be some good way of telling that story. So I really dove in. And I discovered pretty quickly that Allen, the guy in the light-colored jacket, had been in Switzerland during World War II, where he was a station chief for the Office of Strategic Services. And there he was given code number 110. And immediately, my interest kind of perked up. I've always been a little bit of a World War II geek. And probably more importantly, I've always been a frustrated ski bum. And we lived in Germany, where I was a newspaper correspondent, and pretty much every weekend that we could, we'd head down to Switzerland and hit the slopes. And the thought of doing a book that took place in Switzerland sort of really captured my imagination. Allen also became a very interesting figure for me. He was born to a very patrician American family. He had 2 relatives who were secretaries of state. He had served in the State Department early in his career. He'd quit that job to make more money and went to Wall Street. So he got a law degree and worked at the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell. And I really kind of got interested in the idea of the gentleman spy. He had a very little bit of espionage experience when he was sent off for really what was a big job in Switzerland. So at that point, kind of my focus began to shift, and I thought maybe there's a story really just to do with what Allen was up to in World War II. But I still needed a lot more information, and I was particularly concerned and interested to find out what sort of subordinate characters there might be that would help round out the story. Very quickly, I discovered there's a picture of Allen in Switzerland. You can see the Alps in the background, and it looks like he's got a tennis court there. He's accompanied by his number 2 in the OSS Bureau. Very quickly, I discovered this woman. That's Mary Bancroft. Now, Mary came from the same sort of family that Dulles did. She was from Boston. Her father had been publisher of the Wall Street Journal. She'd married an American figure skating champion who competed in the 1928 Olympics. But she left him for what she described as a purely physical attraction to another man. And it turned out that Mary had a real eye for the gentleman. And she ended up meeting a Swiss fella by the name of Jean Ruffenacht. And they moved to Switzerland. She admitted that she didn't really love Jean, but she was really interested in his personal story, at least the story that he told her. Jean claimed that he was part Turkish. It was entirely a lie. He did it just to get Mary's attention. And Mary loved sort of the sense of danger and adventure that she imagined Turkish people entailed, and so they ended up getting married, and they moved to Switzerland, where Mary sort of threw herself into Swiss society. She had a very outgoing and extroverted personality. And I think there was, at times, a little bit of spark with her neighbors. The sort of reserved Swiss weren't the sort that immediately took to her. But she soon met, there's a picture of Mary in Switzerland, she met a lot of notable people, including the famed psychiatrist Carl Jung. And she met Jung when she developed a sort of weird sort of affliction whereby she would start sneezing when she was in socially awkward situations. And so she took this to Jung, who was able to cure her, and she was very much impressed by Jung. Also, I think she developed a little bit of a crush on him. She left a quote where she said that she found him one hell of an attractive guy. And she kind of wormed her way into a group of people who spent a lot of time with Jung and began to study his work. She became pretty well known, especially among Americans in Switzerland. And they recruited her pretty early when they saw that war was coming to do various jobs, kind of State Department jobs, looking at German speeches and writing them up, writing newspaper articles that were favorable to the American government. When Dulles arrived, they introduced her to Dulles, and he immediately asked her to join his team, and she came to sort of assume a fairly important role in what Dulles was doing. And then, very suitable for my purposes in telling a good story, she became Dulles's mistress. And so I thought, here's a good character. She brings a lot of dimension to the story and really fleshes it out. Then I kept looking, and I came across this guy, and that's Hans Bernd Gisevius. Now, he's a German. He was a bit of a hulk of a man. He stood 6'4". Everybody who knew him described him as being insufferably arrogant and difficult to deal with. He had risen through the German security and police services, and he'd been in the Gestapo in the very early days. His career in the Gestapo didn't go very well. He was a real schemer and a plotter, and he decided that he could advance his career by spreading a rumor about the head of the Gestapo. He told people that he thought he was a communist. Now, that didn't go over very well. Gisevius got drummed out of the Gestapo and was actually lucky that he wasn't thrown in jail. But he was able to land a job in another arm of the German intelligence services called the Abwehr. And this was a group that they basically did intelligence for the German military. And Gisevius's attitudes toward the Germans and towards the Nazis was rapidly changing at this point. In the Gestapo, he had seen how nasty the Nazis could be. And I think also, of course, he would never admit it, and I'm just supposing here, but I sure get the feeling that he was just kind of pissed off that his career hadn't gone as well as he hoped. And so he began to plot against the Nazis. They sent him to Switzerland, where he immediately reached out to the British, who were very skeptical of him. And he tried to establish contact with the Americans, who were also pretty worried. I mean, he was not a very trustworthy guy. At best, he was a double agent, and you don't really want to put a lot of confidence in somebody like that. But he quickly met Dulles, and Dulles was willing to meet him, and they developed a good relationship. Now, for me, this was perfect. Aside from these two characters, what was really good was that both of them survived the war and that they wrote about their experiences. Mary wrote an autobiography, which was published in the 80s. She left unpublished versions of it at Radcliffe University, including her diaries and all sorts of really valuable information. Gisevius, too, wrote an autobiography. He worked on it during the war. And what made it really interesting was that it turned out that Mary helped him write it. The fact that she did so was one of Dulles's schemes. He wanted to learn as much as he could about Gisevius. And so, working with Mary, he asked her to help him translate the book and to work on bits and pieces of it. And so he produced it wasn't entirely accurate in places, but it was an insightful account of what it was like to work with Dulles. And so at this point I thought, okay, there's good characters, there's a good story, it's a good time. I just have to figure out kind of what the narrative thread is. What's the plot to this book? There were lots of great anecdotes and spy stories, but I felt like they didn't really link. So at first I tried looking at Dulles's antipathy towards the Soviets. And as you might remember, at this time, the United States was an ally of the Soviet Union, and they were supposed to be our friends. But Dulles didn't buy it, and he spent a lot of the war warning the United States and anybody who would listen that the Soviets weren't to be trusted, and they really were aiming to dominate Europe after the war. So I wrote, actually, some of the book along those lines. And I showed it to my editor, who thought, that's a good idea, but maybe there's a better one looking at the activities of the resistance. And I sort of did what any good author or journalist would do when the editor makes a suggestion. I immediately thought, surely that can't be true. If it was good, I would have thought of it by now. It turned out my editor was dead right. There was a really good story to tell with the resistance, and best of all, the story of the resistance really sort of moved and dovetailed very closely with what Dulles did, and Dulles worked with him. So that really sort of led us to the book that we have now. There's a picture of Dulles taken about this time. He always had the pipe with him. Everybody always talked about that. Dulles arrived in Switzerland in November 1942 rather. His cover, and everybody had some sort of cover. He traveled under his real name, and everybody knew that it was Allen Dulles. But his official explanation for being in Switzerland was that he was a special assistant to the American mission, the American head of mission in Bern. He claimed, and I think probably correctly so, that he was the last American to enter Switzerland before the Germans sealed off the border. And he was really, in a lot of ways, marooned there during the war. He couldn't leave for several years. He wasn't able to receive much help from the OSS. A few agents were able to sneak through from Italy, but he didn't have a great deal of interaction with them. So it was sort of a bit difficult for him. This is the house that he selected. He lived on the first floor, which also served as his office. And he chose this particular location. This picture was taken, I think, around 1933. And it's in the old quarter of Bern on a street called the Herrengasse. And he chose it specifically because there was a busy shopping street on sort of other end of the Herrengasse, so there was a lot of foot traffic going back and forth. And he figured that would provide cover for people who were coming to visit him there at the front door. He occasionally saw what he suspected were German agents across the street, monitoring the comings and goings. Even better was that this house, you can't see it in this picture, but the backyard slopes down gently towards a river, and it was covered with a vineyard. And a lot of his contacts would come up by night. He turned off the lights, and they would come up through the cover of the vineyard to knock at the back door. And he was able to meet a lot of people that way without anybody who was monitoring the front knowing what he was up to. Dulles arrived in Switzerland with some contacts. He'd been in the American diplomatic corps and in the legal profession. He knew some people, and he was able to look them up right off the bat and found out some interesting things. But it was really going to be a pretty slow slog to build up the kind of network that he wanted to achieve. So he employed a couple of techniques. One was simply to buy intelligence. Dulles bragged to everybody about how well financed he was. And word quickly got around Bern, which was a very small town, particularly among the diplomatic and spy community. A British agent once remarked that Dulles may as well have put a sign on the front door that said, "Intelligence purchased here." Another technique that Dulles employed was to simply meet everybody who came along. You know, normally, somebody who's setting up a spy ring, a station chief, would show some discretion before he would meet somebody. Try to feel them out and find out if they were going to feed him bogus information or if they were even dangerous, but not Dulles. And this is from a lesson that he had learned during World War I. He had been in Bern. One Sunday afternoon, he was in the American mission there, and the phone rang, and somebody called up and said, I really need to talk to an American diplomat. Now, Dulles loved to play tennis, and he loved young ladies, and that afternoon he had a tennis date with an attractive one. So he said, I'm busy, call back on Monday. And Dulles later learned that the person who called that day was Vladimir Lenin. And he never learned what Lenin had to say, but it was a lesson that he took very much to heart. And he talked about that throughout his career, about the importance of not prejudging anybody. So with that, Dulles was able to sort of rapidly get to know people. And kind of applying his Lenin principle, it enabled him to meet this guy. I'm sorry, the picture is has some imperfections. His family gave it to me, and it's got a little bit of wear and tear over the years. That is Fritz Kolbe. He was a German member of the foreign ministry. He had kind of a low-level position. He was essentially kind of a clerk. But by the end of the war, he became what was probably America's most important intelligence asset during the entire war. He was a dedicated anti-Nazi and an anti-Bolshevik, and I think he also had a real taste for adventure. He liked the idea of being a spy. And so his position offered him an opportunity to see a lot of top-secret German documents. All three branches of the German military would update the foreign ministry with what they were doing, and he had an opportunity to read these documents and kind of decide what was passed on to who. So he started coming into the foreign ministry on Sundays when it was quiet and everybody was at home, and he would take notes on these top-secret documents in almost unreadable handwriting. And you can imagine the stress he was under, probably writing as rapidly as he could. And he started collecting these documents, but he really didn't have anybody to give them to. He had a friend in Switzerland who at one point reached out to the Brits, who weren't interested. The British had recently been fooled by a similar offer, and they'd lost 2 agents, and this looked like a similar ruse, and they were not going to fall for it. So Kolbe was able to make contact with Dulles. Shortly after Dulles arrived, they had a midnight meeting in an apartment in Bern. And Dulles was at first skeptical, but Kolbe produced about 180 documents on that particular day, including ones that described German codes. He talked about a German agent that was operating in Ireland. And one of the coolest things was a map of Hitler's headquarters on the Eastern Front. And he sketched it out that evening for Dulles, just on a little piece of paper, and said, here's where Hitler holds his briefings, here's the railroad tracks, here's the theater, the whole thing. And you can see that little piece of paper at the National Archives up in College Park. It's really cool. By the end of the war, he supplied the U.S. with about, I think, 2,000 documents and undertook tremendous risks. And, despite having zero training in intelligence and transporting these documents back and forth between Berlin and Switzerland, he tied the copies. He made copies and he just simply tied them around his leg with twine under his pants to get them to Switzerland. And he later developed more sophisticated techniques. But he ended up surviving, and the Nazis never figured him out. It was an amazing accomplishment. What really got Dulles's interest, though, was the stories that Gazavius told him about the German resistance and the underground. Now, at first, Dulles was quite suspicious of Gazavius. The guy was a German agent, after all. But they were meeting together one evening, actually, and in the Herrengasse that we just saw, the Herrengasse Villa. A couple of red leather chairs that were in Dulles's office, and they were having a drink. And Gazavius reached into his pocket and pulled out a little black book. And in this book, or from it, he read a top-secret American cable that had recently been sent from Switzerland to Washington. And there was no way that the Germans should have been able to get their hands on this, let alone been able to decipher the code. And Dulles couldn't believe it. And this is obviously very revealing and worrying information. With this knowledge, the Americans started using the code they knew the Germans could read to send bogus information to kind of confuse the Germans. And of course, they changed it for their real correspondence. But the real importance of it was that Dulles came to really trust Gazavius. The fact that you could read your enemy's codes was not something that you gave away. So what Dulles learned from Gazavius was that there were two fairly distinct resistance movements operating in Germany. One was led by members of the German military. And this guy, despite his rather sour expression, is Ludwig Beck. He had been the chief of staff of the German army until 1938, when he resigned in protest over Hitler's ambitious plans. He represented quite a number of very senior German officers who were opposed to Hitler and wanted to do something about it. He also learned that this character, Karl Gördler, who had been mayor of Leipzig, was a member of this group. Gördler was an eternal optimist. He kind of offset the cold realism and sometimes the negativity of the officer corps. He was probably too optimistic for his own good. He was a bit naive. It did not serve him well in the end. And members of this group also worked, most interestingly, I think, with Wilhelm Canaris. He's the guy, he's in the trench coat with sort of the fur lining, the shorter one there in the center of the screen. And Canaris was the head of the Abwehr, the military intelligence. Now, he had started the war in the early days, and he was a Hitler backer, like a lot of people were in the early days, because Hitler was trying to make up for the horrible Treaty of Versailles. But as the war went along, Canaris really learned to hate the Nazis, and he began to use his position as head of the Abwehr to plot against the Nazis. And he carved out a number of important jobs in the Abwehr for people who were trying to overthrow Hitler and hatching plots against him. It was, it's an amazing thing. Here we are in the center of Berlin, the center of their intelligence, and there's a little nest of people who are trying to overthrow him. It was really a remarkable story. Dulles also learned that about the second group, which was led by Helmut James Graf von Moltke. Now, if there's any sort of hardcore military historians out there, you'll recognize Moltke as being a very famous name in German military history. Moltke was a lawyer by training. He opposed the Nazis from the earliest days. And he set up a group called the Kreisau Circle. This organization was very different from the group of officers. They were younger, they were much more eclectic. There were journalists, there were members of the foreign ministry, academics. They were much more liberal. They initially had a lot of qualms about whether it was morally right to kill Hitler. Maybe a coup would be okay, but was it really morally correct to actually murder somebody? They met in small cells around Germany and had discussions about what sort of economy or political system Germany could have after the war. One of the really interesting things that they did was they tried to avoid writing things down for security purposes. But when they did, they took them to Moltke's estate in the German countryside, and they hid them all in a special compartment in a beehive, which I thought was a great place to keep secret documents. You can imagine any police coming around, taking a look at a beehive and thinking, I'm sure that's fine. Dulles learned something really important from both these groups, and that was that they really wanted American help in deposing Hitler. Not so much in actually trying to kill him or any secret operation, but they wanted a promise from the Americans that they would treat Germany well after there was a coup or after Hitler had been replaced. They all remembered how horrible it had been after World War I and how vindictive they felt the Allies had been towards Germany. And they weren't going to risk their necks deposing Hitler if it was going to be the same thing all over again. Dulles was unable to offer those assurances, and so the resistance did everything they could to try and convince the Americans to, of their sincerity. And they were very clever. They started initially by playing to Dulles's well-known hatred of the Soviet Union, and they said, if the Americans don't help us, I'm sure that Moscow will. And they began to supply Dulles with information that suggested that, it was legitimate, but it certainly served their needs. Despite this, despite the fact that the U.S. wouldn't help them, they continued with their schemes, and probably there were several really interesting attempts to knock off Hitler that came really close. Hitler had an amazing instinct for avoiding assassination or avoiding a coup. I mean, it's just incredible how many times during the war he was able to escape. The resistance moved forward towards a plot which was hatched on July 20th, 1944. This is the famed Valkyrie operation. It was led by sort of a relative newcomer to the resistance, Klaus von Stauffenberg. And he's on the far side of this photo. He's in the light-colored jacket, standing at attention. Stauffenberg had always very much opposed Hitler and had decided the only way to get rid of him was to murder him. And I don't know, I won't go into it in great depth unless you want to later on, because I think it's reasonably well known. There was a movie called Valkyrie a couple of years ago with Tom Cruise, who actually bore quite a resemblance to Stauffenberg. Hitler survived that attack, as I said. He was injured, and people were killed in it, but Hitler survived. And what followed was really, it was bad for the resistance, and it was bad for Hitler, and bad for Dulles, rather. In the weeks and months that followed, thousands of people were rounded up around Germany, and hundreds were executed, including many members of Dulles's circle of informants. And for a time, it really sort of didn't look very good for Dulles. Bancroft talked about how unhappy he was, and the light had kind of gone out of his life. He wasn't quite sure where it was all heading. Kind of by late 1944, he was receiving a lot of surrender offers from various German officers or representatives of them. And Dulles really kind of dismissed those. They all looked pretty self-serving, attempts by people to sort of save their own neck. And Dulles really kind of wondered what would happen to his station. All that changed in the very first part of 1945. Dulles was at home in the Herrengasse one morning, and he received a phone call from a friend in the Swiss intelligence who said that Karl Wolff, who was a general in the SS, he was in charge of the entire SS for Italy, was then in Switzerland and was on his way to see Dulles. Now, this was pretty shocking news. Wolff actually had with him a small entourage of people. They had reserved 2 cars on a regular Swiss passenger train, and they'd pulled the blinds down in both the cars so that nobody could see them. The trip didn't go particularly well. On that particular day, an avalanche swept down across the tracks and blocked his train. He had to get out with all the other members of the German team, march through the snow, and get on a regular Swiss passenger train where they risked being seen. But he did succeed in seeing Dulles that night. They met at a safe house that the OSS maintained in Zurich. And Wolff made a couple of startling declarations to Dulles. First, that he was willing to surrender the entire SS force in Italy to Dulles, that alone was pretty tantalizing. But he also said that he was buddies with Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who was in charge of the German army in Italy. Now, this was pretty explosive stuff. They were talking about the surrender of 1 million men and the end of an entire front. And even more important from Dulles and the Americans' perspective was what it meant for fighting in the Alps. And in the closing stages of the war, the Americans had convinced themselves, really entirely wrongly, that the Germans were going to make a last final stand in the mountains of Austria and Italy. And there was lots of intelligence that suggested that the Germans were building factories and hollowing out tunnels and even building air conditioning in some of these factories. There was a special commando unit that was being established called the Werewolves, which is a great name for a commando unit, I think. And as I said, it turned out it was completely wrong. The intelligence was bogus, and the Americans really fell for a kind of a PR scheme that Joseph Goebbels thought up. But it really paralyzed American thinking. The Americans estimated that if there was some sort of guerrilla war in the Alps, that it could drag World War II out by 2 more years. And it promised to be very bloody fighting. All the advantages that the American military enjoyed were kind of nullified in the mountains. So when they saw an opportunity to end the fighting in Italy and capture these troops or achieve their surrender, that was something that they had to jump on. You can see in this slide, there's Dulles and his number 2, Schulze-Governitz, looking at a map of Italy. The only problem was that the Soviets found out pretty quickly that Dulles was talking to senior German officers. And I think it's fair to say that Stalin pretty much blew a gasket. He had spent the entire war worrying that the U.S. and Britain would cut some sort of secret deal with Germany and that the 3 of them would gang up on him. And this looked exactly like the sort of thing that he had feared all along. What followed were weeks of bitter transmissions between Stalin and Roosevelt, where Stalin accused the Americans of operating behind their back, and Roosevelt tried to calm him down, but Roosevelt kind of got irritated, and a lot of historians kind of look to these exchanges as sort of the beginnings of the Cold War. Another problem was that Wolf grossly oversold his position with Dulles. Kesselring really was not interested in surrendering in Italy. And finally, sort of most dangerous for Wolf was that Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS in Germany, found out that he'd been talking to Dulles. He essentially took Wolf's family hostage back in Germany and said, you better get your tail back here, and we're going to have a pretty serious chat about what you've been up to. So with considerable trepidation, Wolf went back to Berlin and got chewed out by Himmler. And kind of their talk ended with Wolf being ordered to go see Hitler himself that evening. And Wolf left a very interesting account of going to see Hitler late in the war down in the Führer bunker, which was the underground sort of fortress bomb shelter that Hitler lived in. And Wolf kind of spun a story that was part true and part lie. He said, yeah, I've been meeting with Dulles. He figured the Germans had figured that out. But he said it wasn't really to surrender. It was really to cut a good deal for us, some sort of peace deal between Germany and the United States. And he claimed that Dulles had the ear of Roosevelt, and thereby he could communicate directly with Roosevelt. So Hitler sort of calmed down, and he thought that maybe that was a good idea. And in the latter months of the war, that was kind of Hitler's main hope for how the war would end, was that the Americans and the Soviets would have some sort of falling out. He really was never convinced that the communists and the capitalists could really get along for very long. So he sent Wolf back to Italy. Wolf said he was just happy to get home with his head still on his shoulders and to begin new negotiations with Dulles. Those talks sort of dragged on for several weeks, and there were all sorts of sort of misadventures and false starts, but they finally agreed a surrender of German forces, which took place on May 2nd. And Dulles was pretty fired up about that. He had achieved quite a feat. Fortunately, sort of a lot of the accomplishment diminished when the entire German army in Europe surrendered 5 days later. But it still was meaningful. Wolf had no doubt treated American prisoners of war better than he would have, and he had refused to destroy Italian artworks or Italian factories because he was talking to Dulles, and it did end fighting 5 days early, and probably saved hundreds, if not thousands, of American lives. Dulles stayed on in Germany. After the war, he became the station chief for the OSS in Wiesbaden, which is just up the Rhine a little bit from Frankfurt. But his heart really wasn't in it. He kind of disagreed with American occupation policy. The Americans, after the war, had laid down very strict rules that basically barred anybody who had been associated with the Nazi Party from participating in an occupation government. And Dulles really didn't agree with that policy. His prime concern, as always, was the Soviet Union, and he wanted to make sure that Germany really got back on its feet and was stable politically and economically. And if you had to turn to ex-Nazis to achieve that, that was the price you had to pay. I mean, he once said that you can't even make the trains run in Germany on time without the help of ex-Nazis. Dulles spent a lot of time sort of not really managing the staff that was assigned to him, and most of his attention was given to what he called the crown jewels. These were people who he had worked with during the war. He wanted to make sure that they were well looked after. Kolbe, who we saw a few minutes ago, was particularly well looked after. He was given a car and food rations, and basically nobody had a car in Germany right after the war, so that was something. Dulles eventually he left Germany in the fall of 1945 when the OSS was disbanded. He returned to his law practice at Sullivan and Cromwell in New York, And he still was pretty much living in the past. Other lawyers there said that he remained very fixated on the war and just spent as much time as possible reminiscing with old friends who would come by. He got very active in the Council on Foreign Relations and kind of used that platform to argue for treating Germany well and not trying to punish it excessively for the war. He also advised Congress on establishing a new intelligence service to replace the OSS and what eventually became the CIA. And of course, he became the first civilian director of the CIA in 1953. So that concludes my prepared remarks. I'd be happy to try and answer any questions. I guess if you want to ask, you need to make your way to a microphone, which is on either side. There's one over there and one over there. So, yes, sir.
What happened to Mary Bancroft?
I'm glad you asked that question because I have a bonus slide for that very question. And that is Mary there with her legs crossed, and she's sitting with Clover Dulles, who was Dulles's wife. And it turned out that Clover came to Switzerland and joined Dulles while the war was still on. And Dulles, being Dulles, his wife, they had an unhappy marriage, I think it's safe to say. And Clover sometimes kind of got in his hair. So he asked Mary, can you become buddies with my wife and take care of her, which was a pretty bold move. But Mary volunteered, and Clover was quite astute, and she figured out pretty quickly what had been going on. She told Mary, I know what's been up to, and I think the quote was something like, and I approve. She and Mary became pals. So they both were very interested in Jung and studied his writings. And in the closing dates of the war, they even took a tour sort of on the northern border of Switzerland to kind of look across into Germany. And Mary wrote about their trip together and all the horrible things they could see in Germany. And they actually remained friends long after the war. Mary moved to New York, and she continued to study Jung. She wrote some books, and she wrote the autobiography of a spy about her experiences in the 1980s. But she was always, I felt, I wish I could have met her, but she seemed like a really interesting character, somebody who was really comfortable in her own skin and always spoke her mind. Anyone else?
So the station chief, you mentioned the Germans were outside. Did people actually know his actual role? How long did it take before everybody said, "Oh, duh, of course he's the OSS dude"?
That's a good question. It didn't take them long to figure out that he was in Germany, but there had been a newspaper article that was written in a Swiss newspaper shortly after Dulles arrived. And that newspaper article said that this guy, Allen Dulles, is here. He's kind of a well-known diplomat. And the newspaper article said that he was a special emissary from Roosevelt, which was slightly different from Roosevelt's cover story. And Dulles was at first horrified that there was a newspaper article about him. But he kind of realized pretty quickly that, if people want to believe that, I'll let them. And the Germans bought that. They wrote a rather lengthy report, I think it was in January or February of 1943, just a few months after he arrived, saying that Dulles was there, and it had a biography of him, and they had found some Germans who had known him from before the war, and they said, he's in Switzerland, and he's just here on Roosevelt's behalf. And we think he's really most interested in the German economy, gathering intelligence about the German economy. And it really wasn't sort of very late in the war before they kind of figured out that he was OSS. They really sort of clung to this mistaken identity. They knew that he was doing some espionage, but they really didn't know that much about his network. There was a report that the Germans did after Valkyrie in the summer of 1944, and they mentioned Dulles as somebody who had been working with the German resistance. So, they had a pretty good idea what he was about and what he was up to, but certainly they were lacking a lot of the detail.
How did Dulles get the information he was gathering back to the United States so that they could take advantage of it?
That was a constant problem. They had originally, because Switzerland was surrounded by the Germans and the occupied territories, Italians on all sides, they originally experimented by giving documents to diplomats from neutral countries who would smuggle it out of the country through France, to Spain, which was neutral, and they could fly it out from there. But those documents tended to go missing from time to time, so that didn't work very well. They experimented, they would transmit some things just over the telephone, and they knew that the Swiss intelligence service was monitoring their telephone lines. And the Swiss really monitored everybody. The Swiss knew that there were a lot of spies in their country, and they were kind of willing to look the other way, but they wanted to know what everybody was up to. And there were people in the Swiss intelligence service who were pro-American, and there were some who were pro-German. And so you really couldn't transmit very much secret information over the telephone. So Dulles used kind of a very simple code that he would send things back and forth on by telegram. The problem was that the coding was always difficult, and the Swiss helped him out quite a bit with that. There were quite a number of German pilots and aircrew who had been found their way to Switzerland, which was neutral. Maybe they had crashed along the border and snuck into Switzerland, or sometimes if a plane developed mechanical trouble, they would land in Switzerland. And the Swiss wouldn't return them to the U.S., but they allowed them to stay in their country. And Dulles, as I mentioned during the talk, had some friends in Swiss intelligence, and so they let the air crews work with Dulles on a lot of the coding of the secret documents. Later in the war, this was one of the coolest things that they thought of, when they were getting a lot of microfilm of secret documents from Germany, they convinced a railroad engineer who went between Lyon, France, and Geneva to build a special compartment in his train. And it was kind of near the boiler, and so they would put microfilm or documents in this secret compartment, and it actually had a little lever on it, and so if the train was ever inspected, the conductor could hit this lever, and whatever was in this compartment would fall into the flames of the boiler and be incinerated, and you could avoid detection. And so those documents would go to France, where it was met by members of the French underground who bicycled it down to the Mediterranean, and they took it by boat to a location. It was eventually flown to London, where it was looked at, and then sent on to Washington. But they did that really sort of for the bigger documents that they had that were difficult to transcribe, and where they just wanted to send the originals.
Aside from Hitler's intuition, with that much resistance, did you develop any theories about why an assassination attempt never was successful?
Oh, man. It is, the guys in the resistance, you can't but marvel at how brave they were, because if you got caught, and I have to say almost all of them did, at one point or another, you were looking at a pretty grisly death. But Hitler, it's inexplicable. There was an individual that I talk about in the book by the name of Georg Elser, who was, in 1939, he invented a plot where he was going to blow Hitler up. This story kind of illustrates just how lucky Hitler was. He was going to blow up this beer hall that Hitler was speaking in. And the guy was ingenious. He got a job in a construction factory or construction works, and was able to steal some dynamite, which he used for the bomb. And he was a carpenter and invented a really accurate and sophisticated timing device. And he knew the date and time that Hitler was going to be speaking in this beer hall. And so he would go into the beer hall at night, hide in the bathroom till everybody left. And he would come out with his little toolbox, and he carved out a kind of a hollow in one of the support posts on the platform where Hitler was going to speak. He did this over several days and put the bomb in there. Everything worked perfectly. But on that particular night, there was bad weather in the Munich area, and Hitler's pilot said, "I don't think we can fly back to Berlin. You better take the train." So Hitler called off his speech a little bit early, just 10 or 15 minutes early. The bomb went off exactly as timed, with a tremendous explosion. It killed a number of people. When the roof collapsed, Hitler would have been killed, but it was just a matter of bad weather. I could go on and on about similar, just inexplicable twists of fate that spared Hitler. It was incredible. Anybody else?
Since there's nobody else, one more question.
Sure.
Do you have a sense for if the July 20th or any of the other plots against Hitler had succeeded, would have that hastened the end of the war?
I think, yeah, I'm sure so, because the people who wanted to replace Hitler were very keen to end the war. I think they probably, despite the protests from Roosevelt, and this is kind of the fun of history, playing the what if game, but I think that the Americans, if Hitler had been replaced and a new German government came and said, let's quit this nonsense. It's hard to imagine any American government to turn too cold a shoulder to those kinds of offers. It's nothing. It's hard to imagine otherwise that the war wouldn't have ended much more quickly.
And just to follow up, do you think it would have been something other than unconditional surrender in that case?
There's a lot of theories that Dulles was kind of with a wink and a nudge, was telling the Germans just that it's America's stated policy that we will not negotiate with you. But there's actually a document from a German source that claimed that Dulles had told him, you guys get rid of Hitler and I'll see that you guys are looked after. So I think, politically, how could you continue with the war if you had people who were, saying, hey, we got rid of Hitler, we hate him, we want to be your friends. How do you say, no, we're going to fight you to the bitter end? It's hard to imagine otherwise, but it's fun to talk about. Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody. Enjoyed talking to you.
And then, folks, just a reminder, there is a book signing one level up at the Archives bookstore, 15% off on lecture day. So make sure you get your book.
Here's a look